O children of Zion, be glad and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given the early rain for your vindication. He has poured down for you abundant rain. He has the early and the later rain as before. The threshing floors shall be full of grain, the vats shall be overflow with wine and oil. I will repay you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army, which I sent against you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you. And my people shall never again be put to shame. You shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I, the Lord, am your God, and there is no other. And my people shall never again be put to shame. Then afterward I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions, even on the male and female slaves. In those days I will pour out my spirit. I will show portents in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. The gospel lesson today is Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalted themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted.
Would you pray with me? Creator God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So in confirmation class, I teach the students that there are 3 dates in church history that forever changed the way we worship, the way we relate to God, and the entirety of the way we live our lives. Of course, there are many dates in church history that forever impacted our world, but we like to focus on 3s, don't we? So there are 3 dates in particular that I focus on in our class, and one of those dates we are observing today. Now the first date, the one that we're not observing today, was 587 BC. That was when the Babylonians invaded Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, destroying the temple and taking into captivity a good portion of the able-bodied Jewish population. The Babylonians scattered them from Jerusalem, creating the diaspora, the Jews in exile. This incident created religious structures impacting the way we worship today, thousands of years later. It helped fashion the idea of God's nature that's integral to our theological understanding today, and is the focal point for nearly half of our Old Testament. From our modern standpoint, that event forever changed the way we worship, the way we relate to God, and our lives. But that's not the event we're observing today. The second date is 313 AD. On this date, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. After Jesus' death around 33, Christianity began to spread. And as this new way of being faithful to God spread, followers of the way were persecuted. For 2.5 centuries, Christians were arrested, tortured, mutilated, burned, starved, and condemned to participate in gladiator sport for Roman entertainment, simply because of their faith. But in 313, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, decriminalizing Christianity and authorizing it as an acceptable religion for the citizens of the Roman Empire. Furthermore, after issuing that edict, he declared himself a convert to Christianity, encouraging the rest of the Roman Empire to follow suit. From our modern standpoint, this event forever changed the way we worship, the way we relate to God, and the entirety of our lives. But that's not the event we're observing today. Today is Reformation Sunday, and today we remember the third date that forever changed our world, October 31st, 1517. On that day, a young Catholic monk was fed up with what was going on in the church. And a young Catholic monk was upset with the direction the church was going. Excuse me, who are you and what are you doing?
Well,
who do you think you are?
My name is Martin Luther. I'm a young Catholic monk who's fed up with what's going on in the church.
Excuse me?
I'm upset with the direction the church is going. You know, you were just saying a young Catholic monk who was fed up with the direction the church was going, blah, 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 blah.
So, you're telling me that you are Martin Luther?
Well, maybe not. But I'm as close as you're going to get on this Reformation site.
I see. So what brings you to church this Sunday morning?
I have 95 complaints that I want to nail to the church door.
Why are you nailing them to the church door?
I ran out of duct tape. No, because my Facebook account, in all seriousness, my Facebook account has been disabled by the book.
Oh, okay. So nailing to the church door is your only recourse?
That, or I could tweet them, but Twitter has lost so much of its integrity.
Okay, but why are you nailing them to the church door?
Because today is October 31st, All Hallows Eve, the day before All Saints' Day. Tomorrow, All Saints' Day, is a holy day of obligation in the church. Everyone in the entire town of Wittenberg will be here to worship. And when they arrive, they will see my complaints. Nailing them to the church door is the best way to get the word out, even better than putting them in the Friday email.
You mean the entire town of Columbia?
Columbia? No, Wittenberg. Wittenberg, Germany. Where do you think we are?
Well, never mind. But you seem pretty worked up. What is the nature of your complaints?
Of course. Do you want to hear all my fun?
Well, you need to wrap it up before we start singing Let There Be Peace on Earth. So use your time wisely. Give us the Reader's Digest version, will you?
Well, brevity is not my strong suit, anyways, and from what I've heard, it is not yours either. I will try to condense it as best I can. Basically, the foundation of all 95 complaints I have against the church structure has to do with church integrity. With returning the church to the common people who comprise the community. Boy, I'm not talking so well today. English is my second language. With meeting the needs of the 99% of the community who are hurting and aching for a restored connection to God. For the past 1,200 years, ever since Emperor Constantine authorized Christianity in the year 313, the church has focused more and more with establishing doctrine, dogma, rules, regulations, and putting all of these regulations ahead of the needs of the people. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So, Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. But the universal church, in the year of 1517, has established the Sabbath as priority over humanity. Even established the Sabbath as priority over Jesus.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the church has established religious laws, regulations and habits, doctrine and dogma that disenfranchise the common people. In other words, the rules of the Sabbath were prioritized over humanity.
I see where you're going with this. In the year 400, the Bible was translated into Latin, and the church issued a decree that the Bible could only be transcribed from that point on in Latin. For 1,100 years now, monks have copied Bibles for distribution, but only in Latin.
Yeah, and who knows how to read Latin?
Doctors, lawyers, priests, that's about it.
Maybe Monty Python, but the upper 1% of society. Yes, the upper 1%.
Yes, the upper 1% of society in your time were the only ones who knew how to read Latin. Most of the common people, if they knew how to read at all, didn't read Latin. So for 1,100 years, most Christians were not able to read the Bible.
Actually, not only did they not know Latin, but they wouldn't have even had access to the Bible in the first place. The only Bibles that they ever would see would be on the altar of the church. And most people were not allowed up on the chancel. I mean, it's lovely, but common people cannot afford to purchase a Bible. They are simply too expensive. But you are right, even if they could afford the Bible, and they would not be able to read it. The powers that be have set up a system where most people simply do not have access to a Bible.
Well, in your day and age, people could hear the Bible read to them in church, right?
Well, why do you keep saying my day and age? I mean, anyway, you are partially right. They can hear the Bible read to them in church, but guess what language it is read to them in?
Oh, German? Spanish? English?
German, das war wunderbar. No, just in Latin. Not even ich pay Attenley, but straight up Latin. The entire Mass is said in Latin. And who did we say speaks Latin?
Doctors, lawyers, priests, Monty Python.
That's right, the upper 1%. My protest is to bring justice to the 99% of people who are not receiving the benefit of Christ's church. Don't even get me started about communion.
I assume you have some definite ideas about communion?
I told you not to get me started on that subject.
Okay, I think I know where you're going with this one. In your day and age...
Well, there you go with that my day and age line again.
Well, as I was saying, in your day and age, the people were not allowed to take communion. The teaching of the church in those days was that the elements of communion literally transform into the body and the blood of Christ. This teaching was that it's not a memory meal, like we talk about in the United Church of Christ, or even a meal that contains the mystic element of Christ's real presence in some way, but the literal body and blood of Christ. The doctrine was that the elements of communion could not be taken in because of that. In the medieval time period...
What?
The medieval time period. I'll explain that to you later. In the medieval time period, the church issued a decree banning people from taking communion because, since it is literally Christ's body and blood, they were not worthy of taking it into themselves. The church rationalized this practice by telling the 99% that they were afraid the communicants might accidentally spill Christ's body or accidentally defile it in some way. So, to protect Christ's body from accidental defilement, the church withheld communion from the communicants. However, they could come to church and watch the priest take communion. By watching the priest, they would receive the same indulgence as they would if they actually took communion themselves. The medieval church decree of not allowing people to take communion, coupled with limited access to the Bible and a mass said in Latin only, started to drive a wedge between the community and their common expressions of faith.
Those things are just the tip of the iceberg. You just used the word indulgence. The idea of indulgences is what really gets my goat. Do you have any idea what indulgences are?
Yes, I do. Historically, this practice was what really was the straw that broke the camel's back. In the medieval church period, the church created the idea of indulgences. A person was told that one way to receive absolution from sins was to purchase an indulgence. By paying a small sum of money, one could purchase an indulgence for themselves or a family member to theoretically reconcile them with God. The practice began with sound church doctrine, but was commercialized by the powerful elite and used for monetary gain by area bishops and priests. The amount of money required to purchase an indulgence was relatively small, but to a community that had very little excess income, those small fees were quite oppressive. This action also drove a wedge between the community and their common expressions of faith and contributed to a cultural malaise that was explosive, to say the least.
Keep in mind, the indulgences that are being charged are not being used for ministry. Oh no, they're being used to line the coffers of the bishops, priests, middle judicatory officials. None of it is going to help the poor to even maintain our churches. My church in Wittenberg, All Saints Church, is in sound disrepair, but the indulgences taken from my community are just going to make Archbishop Albrecht von Brandenburg richer and even more powerful. In fact, the indulgences that are sold in my hometown of Wittenberg are also being used to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Yet the people of my community are going hungry. This is the central point of my protest. The church is disenfranchising the faithful community, using their own faith as a weapon.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Luther. Thank you.
My friends call me Dr. J, but that's
okay. Sure. So Martin Luther, after posting the 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany on October 31st, 1517, became one of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation. And over the next several years, Luther continued to publish works protesting the apostasy of the church. In 1521, he will be put to trial by the church, questioned by Cardinal Cajetan, and on the authority of Pope Leo X, sentenced to death. Luther, as you can see, has gone into hiding for almost a year, a guest of Frederick, a German prince and a powerful man. But in 1522, Luther returned to Wittenberg and continued his teaching. He He preached a series of sermons that year that helped people realize what Christ is all about and began the offshoot of the church that is now called Protestant. All Protestant denominations have their root in these events that we remember on Reformation Sunday. The focus Luther and his colleagues stood for is justification by faith alone through God's grace. This was the central focus of everything Luther believed and the central doctrine on which his faith stood. We are not justified by the church, our papal authority, he wrote, but by faith alone through God's grace. Our salvation is dependent on God alone. Today's gospel lesson that Andy read, the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, exemplifies a bit of the situation in which Luther found himself. In this parable presented to us in Luke's gospel, Jesus tells of a Pharisee who prays pridefully to God. He brags to God about what a great and faithful man he is. And in contrast, we have a tax collector. Now, you know the tax collectors were despised by the Jewish community for being a Jewish person working for Rome. The tax collector prays humbly to God, asking God's forgiveness for all that separates him from God. And Jesus tells us that the humble man who seeks God's justification as a result of grace is greater than the braggart who feels that he has earned God's justification through his own works. The one who is truly justified in God's eyes is the humble one. So how do we earn God's grace? How do we earn salvation? How do we earn justification? The medieval church in the centuries predating our friend Martin set up a system that ultimately had to fail. It set up a system of merit. Justification, salvation, was distributed by the church according to merit based on human works accomplished. Luther and his followers protested, claiming that salvation and justification are a free gift from God, unearned, a product of God's grace. On this foundation, the church divided, and on this foundation, the Protestant church stands today. Our works do not justify us in God's eyes. We are all saved. We are all forgiven. We are all blessed. We are all freed from the sins that constrain us from God's gracious love. Praise God who gives us this gift of life. Praise God who gives us this gift of unconditional love. And blessings to Martin Luther and all those who went before us in faith, protesting unjust doctrine and misguided dogma and returning the church to the people. Amen.